Hi everyone, welcome back to our 33 Voices Lean Startup series. We're really excited you're here with us because we're here with Christie George, the Director of New Media Ventures, the co-founder of Louder, and the co-owner of the Rio Theater. So clearly she has lots of spare time. Thank you so much for joining us, Christie.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to start out with New Media Ventures because like we were just saying, it's midterm elections today, and I'm so enamored with how you guys want to disrupt politics with new media. Can you give us an introduction to your work?
Yeah, sure. We started a few years ago basically with the idea that technology had such a profound impact in other areas of our lives and had started to profoundly impact politics. And we thought that we might be able to try to catalyze progressive change by financing startups that would disrupt politics, encourage civic engagement, and try to create some progressive change in the world.
Great. And so you were hired as one of the team's first employees back in 2010. What's your best memory from year one?
Oh, what a funny question.
Is it surviving year one?
It's basically surviving year one, I would say. I mean, essentially, we feel like we're in very much uncharted territory in the world of impact investing. We're trying to make a case that you can do good and do well, that you can create political impact with your investments, that you can create progressive change with your investments, that you can make donations as well as debt investments and equity investments, and create social change all while doing that, that we can leverage all the tools in our investment and philanthropic tool belts to create change. Those are all really new concepts for people. In some cases, there have been organizations that have been doing it for years by different names. In other cases, it's an entirely new language for people. It's entirely new to think of their philanthropy and their investments kind of with the same brain. So in many ways, the sort of best memories for year one are just kind of convincing enough people that this was worth giving it a shot.
And that experimentation and going out and getting out of the building, like everyone in the lean group says, is how you did that. How did you apply the lean methodology in the early years?
I mean, essentially, one of the challenges, I think, in the early stage impact investment space particularly is that people are kind of waiting around for the perfect deal. It's totally understandable. It's really early days for this space. And I think that for us, our version of being lean is actually just trying to encourage and oversee investments actually being made. So that means that's everything from the investments we've overseen to actually the grant making that we've done. So we have done some early stage grant making as well, as we found ourselves kind of skewing later stage in our own investment work. We created something called the New Media Ventures Fund, which enabled us to give very small amounts of money to very early stage companies building prototypes. So for us, it meant that we were kind of de-risking our own investment hypothesis by trying things earlier than we might be able to otherwise with other people's money.
Sounds good. As an investor personally, what attracts you to a startup? When do you get that itch to invest?
I mean, ultimately, I think whenever I talk to other investors as well, the first thing that people always come back to is team. I'd say beyond that, we really get excited when we have a sense that an entrepreneur or a team really understands their customer and the problem that they're trying to solve. I think one of the challenges in the impact space in particular is that there are sometimes solutions kind of wandering around searching for a problem. And the best distinctions we see with entrepreneurs are that they deeply understand the problem that they're trying to solve. I think you need certainly entrepreneurs that are passionate and tenacious and can build a great team around them and are aware of their weakness and all of that. But the thing that we get the most excited about and the most intrigued by are entrepreneurs that deeply understand the problem that they're trying to solve.
When you say that, it reminds me of an article I was reading about your work where one of the co-founders of New Media Ventures said, it seems that a lot of people are putting nonprofit ideas directly onto a business model. So what's your best advice for a social enterprise to, whether it's pitching to investors or just growing the company, to get the company to the next level where it is a business and it's thriving to support the nonprofit model?
mean, ultimately, nonprofits have business models. Some business models are more sustainable than others. And I think one thing we can be in danger of is fetishizing certain business models over others. And I think that the advice that I would give is just really understanding what the drivers of revenue are for your particular nonprofit organization, because they're really different for every nonprofit. There are some social change issues or social problems for which nonprofit organizations and nonprofit solutions exist that will never have anything other than a government or a foundation funding base, and that's perfectly okay. There are others which may be driven by small dollar donations on their path to sustainability, and that's also perfectly okay. There are others that may be selling products and services. And so really understanding where revenue is coming from and what is driving that revenue, I think, is the best advice that I can give people who are really exploring various nonprofit business models.
So what do you want to see happen in that space in the next couple of years?
Actually, the thing that I am most excited about that is incredibly unsexy is just a little bit more sharing throughout the field of what various business models are that drive nonprofit organizations. If you are running a consumer web startup, it's pretty easy to kind of get information on growth from other analogous companies. And in the nonprofit sector, my experience is that people tend to be fairly protective of that information under the guise of feeling like that may be their secret sauce. And I happen to believe that the secret sauce is all in the execution anyway, and that we can be as generous as possible in sharing the models themselves. So we have this kind of on our list of things to do internally. As a funder and a funding intermediary, there may be a better and easier opportunity for us to take the time and space to share information about things like business models to the field, when obviously people that are running nonprofit organizations have a million other things to do besides sharing their best practices. I realize that it's difficult to do, but I would love to see us figure out as a field, and maybe this comes from people actually giving funding for people to do it, to share information about how they actually are creating sustainable nonprofit organizations or various business models that work in various contexts, because they each context is obviously not the same, and so that also matters.
I think the sharing part is the secret sauce.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
when
everyone has. And so when you said sharing, it really brings me back to what we were talking about before we started with Louder. Can you tell us about some stories that have really stood out to you and show? How to say this? Are there some stories lately that have showed you why a platform like Louder is so important?
Yeah, I can give you a couple of examples from the very earliest iterations of the company. And this is perhaps true for any platform. You never really know what people are going to do with the platform until you put it into their hands. And to this day, I'm always amazed at the kind of weird, strange, amazing things that people have done. There was, during the moment of Occupy, there was a group of people that got a commercial for Occupy on Fox TV's O'Reilly Factor. During the Greek debt crisis, there were hundreds of Greek expatriates that chipped in literally a couple of dollars at a time to get a billboard promoting tourism to Greece up in Times Square at the height of the debt crisis as a way to kind of help save their country. And I found it so inspiring because I would never have imagined either of those two examples as the things that I really wanted to do or I really wanted to see from the platform. And then a few, maybe at the end of last year, maybe a little bit earlier than that, I ended up using the platform myself because I had seen what I had deemed hate speech running on Muni ads all over San Francisco, and I really wanted to do something about it and realized that that's exactly what Louder was for. So I was able to crowdfund a billboard basically promoting acceptance and anti-hate in San Francisco, a couple blocks away from my office, with a whole bunch of people in my community supporting it. And it ended up being incredibly powerful personally.
How do you incentivize people, Christie, who maybe are not typically inclined to get on a site like Louder, to get on and vote for stories, even if they're not going to put their own stories up?
My sense is that the actual voting happens less from people coming to Louder and more from people actually hearing about it from their friends through Facebook or Twitter, and the places where people already are. We found that Twitter ends up being the place that is the most effective right now for people hearing about Louder campaigns, partly because I think the act of retweeting or the behavior on Twitter really lends itself toward the amplifying behavior that Louder is trying to promote.
Move on then, and now I really want to talk to you about the Rio Theater.
Oh, sure.
You shared with me, and I think it's incredible what you guys are doing, and that's a passion project. It's something that came to you at an unexpected time, but you went with it anyways. And you have so many things on your plate right now. Why was it important for you to do something like that?
The most satisfying part about that project, which is essentially a side project, passion project, totally for the love, is that it is very much about a real physical space. So much of my work, whether it's the internet aspect of it or the technology aspect of it, or even the financing aspect of it, is just completely virtual at the end of the day. And so having something that I could put my hands around, a physical building that's very much about a physical place. It's not going to scale. It's a one-screen movie theater in a beautiful part of Northern California. It's not going to grow like a rocket ship, but it is going to grow very much based on support from the community. Feels like a really nice counterweight to the work that I do now, which I think of as equally important, but is very much about scale and reach and reaching sort of millions of people. So I'm really excited about the theater, and I think we're going to make it into a truly successful cultural destination, but it is still very much about a very specific destination. So that's kind of what I really like about it.
On that note, you're pulled in so many different directions. How are you able to dedicate yourself, Christie, to each of them, to give your best to each project?
That's a great question. I think I am pretty good at compartmentalizing things. So, one thing is that my day-to-day work is really focused on new media ventures. The theater I'm on the board of, but we've got a truly wonderful staff. And Louder is a project that I co-founded, but I am also on the board. I'm not operational on the day-to-day. Louder's CEO, Colin Mutchler, is helming the ship and has a great team that is building that company. They just finished the Matter Accelerator program and are building really interesting partnerships right now. So my roles there are much more advisory. And so I think having sort of complementary roles is what really allows me to kind of do it all. And in all cases, I just really work with great people. So my colleagues at New Media Ventures are fantastic, and at the Rio Theater, both the staff and the other co-owners, and at Louder, which for me is why I do any of these things. I'm interested in being interested, and I like to surround myself with interesting people. And in all three of those projects, I absolutely am.
Perfectly put. I definitely agree. So I want to shift gears for a few minutes and talk about the Lean Startup Conference where you'll be speaking in December. First, how do you want the startups who are applying to New Media Ventures to apply the Lean methodologies before they send in their application?
We really look for people who have evidence of a solution to a really real problem. So the example that I like to give is Upworthy, in which we were one of the early investors, which is now the fastest growing media startup of all time. But when Upworthy started, they really started with an experiment within Move On. And so when they came to us, they didn't even have a company name yet at that point, but they had an experiment that they had run that was enormously successful, that demonstrated a need and that demonstrated a solution, that there was sort of a mechanism for people to share content that had meaning, and that they would do so if you made it really easy for them to do so. So the thing that I would really emphasize to people is to show some evidence about the problem that you're trying to solve. It doesn't actually take much to show. You don't have to have a company name, in fact. You don't have to have your team built out, and you can run a really small, tight experiment that demonstrates the solution pretty clearly.
Right, and one of the ways you guys advocate doing that is being open with failure. How do you suggest founders and companies experiment, fail, and bounce back? Because I know personally from my experience, it's a lot easier said than done.
For sure. If I can just say that I agree wholly with you, it's a lot easier, I think, to talk about your failures once you're successful, and then to kind of trot out your failure stories to round out your experience. It's much harder when you're in the middle of actually failing.
It's not fun.
It's not fun. It's not fun to talk about. If you don't have the follow-on success story, then you're just continuously failing. But we like to think of that as actually continuously learning and saving yourself basically time. So one thing I would say is just to know that, failure is learning, and that's actually what you're doing and what your whole job is at the earliest stage. Two, at the early stage, it's mostly failure anyway, and people who tell you otherwise are not at the early stage. They're probably much later and have way more failures behind them than they're even willing to admit. And to focus on the learning. So whenever we talk to people, entrepreneurs in particular, but even people in our portfolio company, if it's clear what you're trying to learn, then the results are not quite failure. They're just data. And we should sort of feel dispassionately about it. Although, again, way easier said than done.
Easier said than done, but I like how you said it, so keeping it as the results are data is great. What can we expect, Christie, for your talk in December?
So actually this year, I'm pretty excited because I'm doing an interview instead of a talk. And I am interviewing Mitch Kapor
Very cool.
from Kapor Capital and the Kapor Center for Social Impact. And we're actually going to talk about for-profit, mission-driven businesses, and talking about impact in the context of for-profit, mission-driven businesses. Obviously, Mitch has years of experience that he's going to share, but I think what's really interesting about him is that he sits kind of at the intersection of philanthropy and technology and impact investing, and also has a lens of basically increasing the diversity of the technology community. And I think that his most recent investments are a really clear and active demonstration of how you can have a diversity lens and really just support amazing businesses that are creating social change.
Great. Well, we're really looking forward to that. So we can't wait to see you there. And then before we close, we have a few questions for you from our viewers. And the first one is from Michael Crawford, and it's about education. He wants to know, in what ways has your formal schooling experience contributed to who and where you are today?
Oh, thanks for the question. My most recent education experience formally was graduate school, and I did my MBA at Oxford under a fellowship from the Skoll Foundation. Mm-hmm. And so it was really that experience and the fellowship that exposed me to this world of social entrepreneurship and social enterprise that I was probably practicing before I got there, but didn't have a language around it. And so it actually contributed enormously to where I kind of ended up. I suspect that while I might have been able to do the job that I do now without that education, I'm not sure I would have had the opportunity to do the job that I am doing now without that education. And then the other thing is that I really appreciate, having done my MBA abroad, I think of myself as having a kind of global lens. And so even though New Media Ventures at the moment is investing in companies in the U.S. that are primarily affecting U.S. Progressive politics, I think that I personally at least have a sort of international perspective that I bring, which has been helpful.
That could really, sounds corny, but that could change the world. That could completely reimagine how we do things, especially on such important topics. And our last question then is from Josh, another viewer in our community, and she wants to know, As a startup, how would you use the lead methodology to retain customers and suppliers?
That's a great question. I haven't really thought about suppliers. My guess with suppliers is that making sure that they're invested in the methodology as much as you are is probably one way of retaining them, but I can kind of give it some thought and perhaps answer in a follow-up. In my experience with customers, if you bring customers along with your experiments, even if the experiment fails, people are generally on board enough with the mission that they're willing to go along with you on the next 7 experiments. So in my experience, people tend to be, especially if they're really doing true lean startup work, you're kind of shipping out messy product. And my experience is that if you actually are as transparent with people as possible, they'll be interested enough in what you're trying to learn that they will kind of come along the journey with you. And it ends up being an incredibly interesting customer retention tool.
How do you work with them on the journey? So maybe you're on experiment 4, and experiment 4 tanks. What do you do? Do you reach out to them and ask, how would you like this improved in the future? Or do you see, what's the best way we can retain them? What do you think is the best way to keep in touch?
I think it's mostly to have people bought into the mission of what you're trying to do. So mission being mission for your company or mission for your nonprofit organization. As soon as you've got people bought into that, people just have a much higher tolerance than we give them credit for the failures of experiment 4, 5, and 6, because they actually want the enterprise and you to succeed. Generally, people want people to succeed. And if they're going to be wasting or spending their time, depending on how you want to put it, they want to be making sure that that time is spent helping something grow.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Christie. It was an absolute pleasure to spend time with you today. Can we close with you letting our viewers know how they can stay in touch with you and keep up to date with your work?
Yeah, sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Christie George. You can also sign up for the New Media Ventures newsletter at newmediaventures.org and check out the Rio Theater at riotheater.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.